Hello everyone, today we make a reflection on an unpleasant aspect of our culture. Talking about it is not a weakness, all the same, it actually is strength of it. And it's something that at this point in history is also pretty much acknowledged, right? I've gotten a very few anti-Semitic remarks on my videos. I normally got completely rid of them. Sometimes they came from people that were, regular subscribers, but it happened like 2 times, right, in 40 years. And I, maybe in that case I didn't block, but I surely didn't allow the comment, and hoping certain people can, knowing that they're intelligent enough, they can understand why this is not really acceptable. And in this sense, I would like to stress that Schwerpunkt is properly not just an anti-racist, anti-Semitic, anti-ethno-nationalistic channel, as it is not anti-fascist, as it is anti-fascist, anti-communist, anti-Nazist, or whatever. We try to tell history for what it was, in ways that can hopefully make the listeners, the audience, understand that certain realities are always more complex than they seem. This is no excuse to make moral relativism about it, and the core of the thing stands exactly there. That is to say, history is not a way to mix cards, right? The more info you get in, and the more confused it can get. Just today I was having a conversation but through private means with a person who asserted that, history can never be proven. Yes, if we are at those level, like there are entire countries I've met, properly people, hundreds of people that have this as a main, as the average mentality. Of course, naturally to cover up some of the most ferocious abominations in the history of mankind. In that case was specifically socialism, actually, totalitarian regimes in that sense, also anti-Semitism, any kind of, because it all gets intertwined, right? It's just historical illiterate to presume that, anti-Semitism was. I met a lot of people, for example, that believed, right, this in my university field, that, anti-Semitism was born like with the rise of nationalism. I remember always the myth, let's say, because it also wrongly, talk about dates, right? Nationalism was mostly, condensated and concretized by the 19th century. This guy was an ignorant, of course. He was talking about the 20th century, because in his mind, it's just, of course, what brought the ferocious nationalism and that stood actually behind Nazi fascism, but also all the anti-Semitic, of course, plurisecular, if not millennial tradition existed at the time. But anti-Semitism or ethno-nationalism or imperialism or racism was proper actually of, in racism especially, maybe in a kind of crypto cell, kind of not embryo form in some cases, but definitely also and renowningly in the Soviet Union, in communist regimes all around the world that carried out ethnic cleansing here and there, and anti-Judaism, to say it better, because frankly, anti-Semitism is a confusing word, right? Of course, there are a lot of people who hate Arabs the same way, but naturally it's very important to understand that, I don't know, if the Nazis were searching for Arab sympathies in the 1930s, the 1940s to move in an anti-Zionistic sense, right? That tells you that specifically anti-Judaism in itself, and there are reasons for this that are as ugly as the consequences, about within European history not only, but this is an aspect that, of course, we still have to, I guess, properly swallow and digest at a popular level in Western civilization. That anti-Semitism is something that I personally come from. We'll see it now, that anti-Semitism wasn't quite the same everywhere. Like, there were at this point we're talking about late modern history, so in moments where more or less the national profile of modern countries was there, right, aside from, unfortunately, from the ethnic cleansing of the 20th century mostly, that literally redrew the ethnic map of Europe, especially in the Central East mostly. But anti-Semitism is something you still come across, right? And I come specifically from a background that not only has never known anti-Semitism in a familiar background. I'm not a Jew, by the way, and I have, I did meet, like, I know Jewish people since childhood, etc. But aside from always having had a very positive bias towards them, to the specific individuals I've met, but I also properly don't come, I believe, from a culture that was particularly anti-Semitic. My countries did implement racial laws against the Jews back in the day, as it was an Axis power. I stick, of course, like in this broader, in Europe, at some point, unless, for very few countries, we were out of fascist or communism back in the day. So I, of course, am sensitive, and in a sense, my country is doing very well in terms of international relations and properly, putting on the for the Jewish question for what it was historically, right? It's another relativism often made. The Jewish question did exist, but those anti-Judaic people mean it, that was a Jewish problem, like, or something, related to them, right? And things are dramatically less pleasant than they seem, especially in certain contexts that, however, explain you why this was the case. The history of Judaism is very fascinating. It's very poorly known. That today's Jewry fundamentally is also separated into two branches, right? One is mostly associated with, let's say, the refugees of the Holocaust, or previous pogroms, persecutions that went on for centuries in the Americas, right? It's mostly the liberal Jews that live in the United States that are, properly modern, like open. They have and there are very different backgrounds in this regard. And there is a more conservative Judaism, properly in its orthodoxy, mostly prevalent in Israel, that comes from the origins of the individuals are very much the same, but the different historical paths to make them take different directions. But differences did exist because the majority of Jews was mostly concentrated in Central Eastern Europe, right? In the other countries, they had either been expelled since the Middle Ages. Of course, they had remained in part, and or were less, properly from a quantitative point of view. Countries like Germany, like Poland, the majority of Jews were exterminated during the Holocaust were Polish Jews, right? Because historically the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had been quite welcoming towards them, which doesn't mean that there wasn't discrimination, but as a chronically, the declining central power like the one of Polish monarchy in those centuries, calling in lots of immigrants from other countries. It was done by other realities as well, but there wasn't quite a Jewish state at the time. Like, mostly the Protestants fled to Protestant countries, and that was kind of, keeping the glue together. But in places like, in this other one, the Jews accumulated properly as a very large community that, however, was emarginated with such a degree of ferocity by, other parts of society that it basically remained isolated from the rest of society. So that anti-Semitism developed as a you see the stupidity of it, of course, the fact you are the ones that basically prevented from these people to dilute with the rest of the population, and you are the same ones to get nervous now and, use them as a scapegoat to it. It is true that the Jewish population, in this sense, was living in those countries with a different mentality. Sometimes here we're talking about the 1683 Vienna the Christian victory. Of course, we will see what is historically documented. It is, of course, that the Jews, in part, had sympathies, for example, towards the Ottoman Empire. It was dramatically more tolerant towards them than Christian reality was, but also not all Christian realities were. For example, it's also notorious that instead the Dutch and the Italian Jewry was a much better integrated one. It was discriminated, it was placed in ghettos, etc. But it was open to contact right? They had the Dutch and Italian Jewry had an educated elite, right? In countries like Germany, like Poland, and by the time the Enlightenment spread, well, the few educated Jews at that point were took seriously and legitimately so the dramatic task of educating these masses that had remained essentially in a dramatic, appalling moral and material misery. With, by the way, a very interesting, anthropologically speaking, version of Judaism, in a sense, that very often was just, literally, also from a linguistical point of view, something completely unintelligible that had hardly to do with a broader structure, intellectual creed. It was just a set of traditional practices, a way of saying that, of course, were also very much reflecting of in part of the same, think Yiddish, that, just linguistically speaking, essentially it's German in its, and so it's a story that eventually, and then the pogroms, right? The reason why it was so much anti-Semitism, for example, and still is, right, in countries like Poland or Germany, or whatever, by modern standards, is that during the 18th, the 19th century, many Jews were actually were foreign, in the sense that were coming from Russia, because in Russia it was also ferocious anti-Semitism. Every once in a while, what to do? Well, let's make a pogrom. Like, let's slaughter some people. That happened. So many Russian Jews escaped to the West. Naturally, at the time, Poland was a way more advanced country than Russia, in a sense, in the average, terms of socioeconomical standards. And of course the Russian Jews that arrived were sometimes definitely not. It's like immigrants today. Who does normally immigrate from people that are kind of have poor, less educated, etc. Therefore, the stereotype there goes by. And they spoke another language, and they fit into this already undiluted communities that fueled again this sense of hatred, saying, the Jews are something different, whatever. In fact, these times we're talking about in the 1680, after post 1683, let's say, are the ones during most of the 18th century which properly a crypto-proto-pseudo-racism properly meant was born. That racism is also like one of the greatest myths of modernism, I would say, in this in our world, as the Moron before that was saying that anti-Semitism was born because of nationalism. Anti-Semitism was, how do you think Jews lived during the Middle Ages? They were discriminated against, of course, since the beginning. It was just yesterday we were talking about Justinian, his laws against the Jews, all these. But what the whole deal was, right? That the Jews were kept in, aside from practical reasons, because of, they could, since from the Christian view, they had to go to hell. They could practice things like usury or whatever. But the truth being that, aside from the fact that also Christians did it regularly, that the Jews were, in this sense, often something different, from something alien, right? Many, for example, the Central Eastern European Jews are mostly. This is a great problem in modern, especially in Orthodox Judaism, certain aspects of Rabbinism, because there is the problem that the Jews theoretically they descend from the original tribes, so that there would be a matter of blood for there, right? But most of those Jews were actually converted people from mostly Khazar. That the Khazars had converted. They were largely, they had converted to Judaism at some point in the High Middle Ages, mostly to be presentable to the Byzantines in a way. Some of them were actually Christians, others were Muslims, and many were pagans. But when the Russians destroyed the Khazar Khanate, lots of these people reversed into Eastern Europe. So that, for example, in the videos we made on medieval urban development, we see that some of the main centers, let's say in Eastern Europe, never seen urbanism, never seen a real, development since, the dawn of civilizations in those terms, were actually fueled by the Jewish merchants. The Ramanids were, for example, also in Mediterranean. Before the Italians, were factually the people who, within the Islamic broad, intercontinental trade were the ones who carried out the thing. And even in there was already the bias, because naturally these were studying from the side of the Muslims. There were some communities, I don't know, in southern Spain were properly, specializing in castrating the Christian or pagans or non-Muslim slaves, because that was a florid market, not just of slavery, but properly of eunuchs, as you know, in certain cultures. So there was this idea that aside from the stereotype, of course, of the deicides, the ones that had killed Jesus, as a, and that was a Jew himself, that only St. Paul, through his teaching, made of it a Christian religion, so something else, and that's also something that, it's not really quite so much that other thing nobody really talked about. St. Peter in Rome wanted effectively to kill St. Paul, so that the Romans had to send them escorts because they feared that. St. Paul was also a Roman citizen, by the way, and that's why he was beheaded while Peter was crucified. But aside from that was this inherent tension, of course, of this community that was essentially the only non-Christian one allowed in Christian society, because theoretically the Jews were not just the most akin to Christians in religious terms, but also the ones that for this reason had to serve as witness of the new come of Christ at the end of times, and therefore, to say, haha, we were the right ones, see it, witness, right? And there was naturally, this is, that, as you understand, I'm quite very much ferociously against any kind of anti-Judaic discrimination. But I like to point out also the positive aspects of interaction, right, given these standards that existed between Christians and Jews, right? For example, the church itself was actually the single most protective institution towards the Jewry compared to common people, right? With all the programs that resume in this, emotional trails, for example, since the First Crusade, etc., the ones that protected Jews sword in hands were Christian bishops against the most radically disgusting mob of what you can imagine in the Middle Ages that had, of course, it wasn't even about the fact that those guys were Jews. That was just an excuse, right, legally speaking, because, of course, they wanted to steal their own stuff, right? And the church was extremely protective in this sense, because also as a government didn't want trouble, and you can't live in a society. Of course, it's not that they probably gave much damn about the Jews themselves per se, or wouldn't think they were vicious sinners like properly the same Christian liturgy actually still presents within the Catholic one. If you read, we will see it now, the Perfidi Judei, right? But it says, of course, also pray for them, for their conversion, but technically it's still, as a government, the church had to keep public order. That, as we see, it's the most foundational, probably, of all civilizational values. You can't have a civilization of any sort if you don't have a public order, security, police, people that prevent any scumbag to think that they're better than others and they can't, start, doing whatever the hell they want. And this is, of course, something that normally the scum of society doesn't like, because the scum of society lives within that ambiguity and thinks better to fuel. In fact, what are the anti-Semitic environments today? Of highly intellectual people. They're basically marginated, undereducated, intellectually underdeveloped individuals. So it's always the same picture, right? It's always a matter of populism. Doesn't matter whether it's right-wing or left-wing. That's another disgusting thing about our own world, that anti-Semitism exists as much as in the right wing, as much as in the left wing. And it's utterly disgusting. And here I'm not even talking about, because here, one thing is being an extremist, one thing is also being, fake radical, chic, liberal type that eventually comes out with a stupid anti-Semitic joke, right? And it's plenty of them. I did meet them and had to school them about something in history, of course, they had missed in their pseudo-intellectual environment. So having said this, it's important to understand properly also the Jewish perspective in this all, because it wasn't easy to live like that. He would have surely not liked to live like that either. So, as we have seen, after 1683, this was a major event in Christendom, right? We have largely, one of the reasons why we also don't understand Judaism properly is that we have largely forgotten in Western civilization Middle European culture, right? Normally, Western Europeans, Northern Europeans, Southern Europeans, Eastern Europeans do not quite grasp what Central European culture is concretely about and how powerful fundamentally the 1683 and all its main participants was for properly Western history, world history as a whole, right? Here, we don't digress on the kind of, also important and, debatable consequences of a fall of Vienna in 1683. But it's obvious that primarily, we always make the step, let's say, before seeing what we reason in history terms theologically, right? So we see 1683, we think about the France of Louis XIV, we think about Britain, we think about the Netherlands, and not even these countries were actually already that obviously, on the fore ones. Especially France, if it was mostly because of that intervention in Central European culture, rather for the broader colonialistic, progressistic, modernistic, and Western narrowly meant picture that we have, let's say, considering the later centuries, right? At the end of the 17th century here was, with the War of Candia, the moment in which, for example, Northern Europe first historically surpassed Southern Europe in terms of per capita wealth, and just actually in the Netherlands and in Britain, right? And for colonial empires fundamentally. So the rest of Europe altogether was still within what we would consider fundamentally a medieval reality. We have seen it with the Habsburgs, with the empire broadly meant, in Eastern Europe as well. These were communities that had gone very different chain, and the core, ideology, with all the hypocrisy of it, with all the already, sports of modernity and necessity to centralization, to development, etc., was fundamentally revolving around an unsecularized, foundationally Christian reality. So 1683 was the greatest victory of Christendom. In this perspective, was the victory of Crusaders, was the destruction of the other faiths, of Satan, or whatever had come to alter the order and the glory of Christ, right? So we have to make the effort, even, of course, when we see this reaction, understand, but what were those people living by, right? People living, that basically the average person was a serf, right? Lived under a lord. You don't know what it feels to live under a lord. These lords were people that considered anybody that was not of noble blood as a proto-racially inferior individual. All right. So you understand how easy or how worse could be just thinking about somebody who was not Christian too in the process. War was considered as a rightful and proud and good sport of the nobility, right? It was showing its ever more difficult, destructive, and impacting face, so that it would spur also the centralization, state making in a modern sense, etc. So ideologically speaking, we're talking again really barely modern or secularized society. If this is the first time in history where you can start, by modern standard, you can start talking about that in the first place. You can imagine the set of prejudices, of superstition. Hell, here, Newtonian physics was yet to come concretely in this world. Like, you leave believing ghosts and spirits and things that's strange. Also, Newton believed, actually in the story of the Bible, but literally today Christian theologians do not do it anymore themselves. So it's a different society, right? It's a different culture, it's a different community. And so big victory of the empire, of Catholicism, of all those who had brought properly victory to this reality. And obviously after the defeat of the Ottomans under the gates of Vienna, there was the exaltation of triumph, etc. But within it was the remembering, right? Or at least they also started to invent, because this is the deal, that the heathen dog, right? The enemy heathen dog. So just speaking about the Ottomans, it doesn't matter that many of them were actually Christian, meaning that there were Serbians, there were Bulgarians, there were Hungarians, etc. But for that matter, a Calvinist Hungarian was definitely hated way more than an Islamic Turk by a Catholic Austrian, right? And this is also important to understand, as this was reciprocated. I mean, Northern Europeans, Protestants, hated easily the papacy and Catholicism more than they hated the Muslims. In fact, they actively even supported them against Christendom altogether. Because at that point, especially after the end of the 30 Years' War, naturally, you know that lots of things changed in terms of, it's not really confession that makes the difference, but rather the nation, the country, which one it is. And this had been exemplified by the fact that, in fact, within Christendom, the Ottomans had their own partisans, if not accomplices. And here I began the video with a beautiful picture of Louis XIV that is actually one of my favorite historical characters. I didn't talk about him specifically. We talk about him in this thing about Vienna, also in the Prince again series, etc. But, I mean, Louis XIV century France is second modern Europe incarnated properly in the magnitude and in the superiority of its own civilization. Well, as we know very well, the Sun King had fundamentally supported the Ottomans against the Habsburgs, right? Not because he hoped that the Ottomans would swarm into Germany or into Italy. At that point, he knew that the French would have been the next ones that would have had to take matter in their own hands. That was already the knowledge of Francis I. But hell, even the Habsburgs had basically let Hungary being destroyed back in the day by the Turks, just for their own profit. So realpolitik is concretely this one. And naturally, as a good Catholic and the most Catholic kingdom of, King of France, Louis had followed the trail, right? Not very quickly, telling the truth, not very willingly, as you understand, of the congratulations that from all Christendom arrived to the Emperor, to the Holy Roman Emperor, to the Pope, of course, to the King of Poland, that had contributed remarkably, as we know, to the victory of Vienna. So all Catholic powers, of course. It happened that some French traveler abroad was attacked or mocked because of the ambiguous behavior of their own sovereign. So this would be normal, but the wave that followed in an anti-Judaic sense was definitely the harshest, the most violent, properly targeting the Jews, right? Because these had been suspected of sympathies towards the Turk. And as we were saying before, it's hard to believe how the Jews would have not had such sympathies, meaning that since between the 14th, the 15th century, the 16th century, many of their co-religionaries that were kicked out of Spain in a process of forced conversion of the, you understand, the Proto-Racism, we're speaking of limpieza de sangre, or, the nuevos cristianos, or things like these, lays already. Because, again, I wasn't finished about that before. I wanted to say that you don't need to be racist to be ferociously discriminatory, right? One of the greatest myths in modernity is that we invented ethnic discrimination with pseudo-scientific racism, with social Darwinism, etc. in the 19th century. This is bullshit. This is one of the greatest tales that leftism has thrown around from the inferiority of its own, illiterate culture, to pretend that discrimination is somewhat based on a matter of, political color. It's actually inherently human, and in the way you forget about that, you diminish it, and you responsibilize yourself. It says, I'm a liberal, so I can't be a racist. Do you really think about that? Because that's one of the single most stupid things you can ever pronounce, right? There is an ingrained suspicion towards the different, wherever it is, right? All human groups, all humans, because we're all alike, right? Independently from our skin color, whatever, are by default defensive towards outsiders, right? Any minority in human societies is being targeted in a way or another, and or subject of discrimination, right? And this is important to stress. And this has been done mostly to stress things like, in the ancient world, in the medieval world, there wasn't racism. Everything was tolerant, man. The Romans were tolerant. The medieval kings were tolerant, man. Look at the Normans in Sicily, they were Arabs and Christians. That's bullshit. That was just a balance, right? As we were saying before, out of pure political convenience to keep different communities that could counterbalance each other power in order for the top, that was in this sense always veryesterophile in a sense, like all elites are generally speaking, to keep down the rest of people that could strip them of power, hamper the broader process of centralization. If you think that Romans were ethnically tolerant, I don't think you have ever read Horace. I don't think you have even read the Golden Ass of Apuleius. You're just an illiterate moron, and that's how it is, right? It's that simple, right? Because if you have never studied these things, it means that properly about that word you don't know anything for serious scientific standards, right? The same goes for the Middle Ages. Yes, tolerance. Look in fact at how Muslims were or Jews were treated. There was hardly any tolerance, and Christians by Muslims as well. It was the same in Antioch. It was pretty standard. It was no difference, right? It's just that human intelligence in the form of civilization prevails over time. That's the reason why today we have human rights in the first place, and we should also be thankful to the fact that what we have today, yes, did also pass through the horrors of discrimination, etc. But those things were fixed, right? Because if we were irreversibly racist people at this point, humanity would have already extinguished itself, right? So reality, fortunately, is always very different, right? And you can find, even if it's not 7%, but maybe it's 99%, and that 1% summing over the years makes that civilization happen, of goodness, of something that gives a positive development to communities, right? So I don't remember how I was arriving here as always, but anyhow, as we were saying before, the Jews had undergone a dramatic amount of discrimination, and that in the Dar al-Islam, mostly at this point, at least coming from Europe East, dominated by the Ottomans, at least the first one they could meet, Jews were not treated much better than within Christendom. This is also a macro-historiographically known acquisition. Like, there are so many examples that are, aside just from the amount of sources, but that are very meaningful. There were Christian Europeans in early modern Europe that would convert themselves to Judaism in order to emigrate to the Ottoman Empire because of the benefits that could get from that status there. And we're talking about not desperate people. We are actually talking about rich people that, of course, because of their capitals, were welcomed by the Ottomans, but also properly people that belong to powers like, I don't know, like the ones that were fighting actually against the same Muslims in that regard. There are lots of Venetian merchants who did this, right? Literally writing from Constantinople to their wives, look, come here, convert to Judaism, because their pious wives in Venice say, no, I remain a Christian, I won't come there. There are other anecdotes, like there were some dramatically rich Jewish heiresses from the Netherlands that the world Charles the imperial espionage net of Charles V in the 16th century would track their movements, like because there was something in the air that they would migrate to the Ottoman Empire, of course, through Venice as always, because that's the gate of the East via sea. They would pass into the Ottoman Empire, and of course, remember this: the more the war between two civilizations, the more the intersection between them, the more the hybrid between them, right? And indeed, there is a lot of civilization in these mechanisms as well. Look at all the Western advisors at the Ottoman army. Look at all the, the gifts that the European nobility would do by replicating Ottoman panoplies. Like if you have traveled across Central Europe, you know that every castle has its own Turkish armor made there in places like, I don't know, in Austria, in Germany, etc., because noblemen were absolutely fond of Ottoman stuff. They wanted to have it on their own at the same time. And this, of course, goes in parallel with the most radically violent, vicious, oppressive, disgusting, enormous violence and utter, people chopped to pieces, roasted, skin scorched alive, raped, slave trade. That was the reality of the Christian Ottoman frontier in early modern Europe, from both sides, right? Slave markets were present, many centers on the North African coast, as in Tuscany, as in other places, and people profited from this as well. Think about Cervantes. Think about some of the greatest pillars in Western thought and literature were heavily involved in these stuff as well. Directly, for better or for worse. Now, mostly for worse, because such experiences were hardly positive. But I made a video which is the one of the Sultanate of women that tells you effectively how even a slave could become empress, and the most powerful woman of the time. And those were very lucky indeed, or maybe, who knows, if they had stayed home, but would dialogue with the higher levels of the higher rulers at the time. This has to do also with the broader mechanism of succession of Ottoman sultans, but it's another deal. Anyhow, shortly after the victory of Vienna, so during the Balkan campaign that would have brought to the liberation first of Budapest, then of Belgrade, scenes of violence and robbing of directed against the Jewish communities broke out again, right? And these were periodically customary, at least since the 11th century, as we were saying before, in coincidence with the proclamation of crusades or with the spreading of news relative to the profanation, for example, hosts or ritual infanticides were perpetrated in this sense. A child was killed or a host was going to desecrate. It was the Jews, right? It was the mentality. And this happened also against other elements of society, right? This is a moment in which, for example, the poor are increasingly marginated. As you know, witch hunting is something way more modern than medieval, especially in Protestant countries, especially that was at its worst, historical standards, up to, people burned witches in New England up to the 18th century. By the second 16th century, half of the 16th century, that burning a woman for witchcraft in the papal curia would have been considered madness already. So we often have in the West still this lacks of, properly of, this dramatic problems, moral relativism and amnesia, historical amnesia, because those are things that, again, are dramatically well documented, extensively so, by anybody who knows its historiography. But the deal was exactly this one, where there was a regular scapegoat. Right, consider that the Catholic liturgy, for example, Holy Thursday says, even if to pray for the Jews, right, of course, but so that they could be converted, such as the pagans. But of course, they were, Jews were better in the degree of, let's say, of sinfulness than the pagans, etc. They were named in the same liturgy. You can read Perfidi Judei, right? So that's quite meaningful. Now, in the Balkan Peninsula, the Christian reconquest that followed through Prince Eugen series, as you know, what happened, essentially the Habsburgs recovered mostly the Balkans, they invaded even further south, etc. Well, these were areas that since the 14th century had been gradually occupied by the Ottomans, and in the process, there was an enormous storm of persecutory fury against the Jews, right? That brought thus to a drastic worsening of their own civil and social conditions. Many of them perhaps would have actually expected a protection from the Holy Roman Emperor, given the remarkable economical and financial support that the so-called Hofjuden, so the court Jews, had longly and massively provided, right, to the Christian armies, right, to the imperial armies. The Marys, for example, one of them we mentioned also back in the day, Samuel Oppenheimer, that had gained, enormous merit prestige by supplying imperial troops, also during the same siege of Vienna, right? These were prominent figures at court, were very important, but these courts were still very anti-Semitic in nature, and the thing would remain for a long time, right, up to essentially the reforms of Joseph II of Leopold, like of his brother, in the second half of the 18th century. So 1 century afterwards, where properly patents of tolerance were issued for, free, for freedom of religion, the Jewish religion, always, as you understand, even always under the protection. Like, this is the logic of the Ancien Regime, that eventually Napoleon took this beyond with the nation state, whatever. But that's a different juridical matter. But it's still the idea that you are under a lord here, right? And he decides whether you can have a right or not. Naturally, the enlightened reforms of Austria were some of they made enormous step forward in this sense as well. They're some of the most positive elements, in that history period. But I don't know. Maria Theresia, for example, was staunchly anti-Semitic. But her sons, at this point, they would carry out, already further some reforms that already for her mentality here times were speeding up dramatically, right? And, she would have criticized. She thought Joseph was too open, right? Too modern, too like, they wouldn't hold things together. Eventually, the history of those went differently. Eventually, they transformed effectively in a state of police, also because communistic instances had spread. So a completely different mentality emerged, one of under siege, that also all over Europe fueled this sense also of ethno-nationalism, of purity, of homogeneity, which also, in fact, pseudo-scientific racism was enucleated properly in the way we have known up to not even a very few generations ago. However, we should point out that even after the victory of Vienna, there were many cases of Israelitic communities' participation to the dejubilation of Christian forces after throughout all these victories, not just after Vienna, but through the breakthrough that the Christians managed to do within the Ottoman Empire. However, we also have to be equally objective and say that these were rather, just mildly warm and not very convincing manifestations, pour cause, could say, because, again, people travelers, merchants from the West knew pretty well, and they had seen it many times, how much the Jews of the Ottoman Empire, that in that sense were, again, it's not just a religious discrimination, it's because it was their country, right? Where they were worried about their living condition there at the same time, were, however, comparatively much more enthusiastic for, let's say, the victories of the Sultanian armies than, in fact, the Jewish communities living in Christian were at the news of Christian victories against the same Ottoman Empire. And we shouldn't, in this sense, underestimate how important the siege of Vienna and its immediate consequences were for the situation of the Jews in Central, also in Southern Europe, and it's almost a plaque tournant, right? A moment of passage, right? In part of the thought and the attitudes of the Europe of the time, right? Anti-Judaism, with its essentially theological and controversistical characteristics, right? So an attitude that included naturally the hope and the will of a Jewish conversion to Christianity, right? And that were transformed in this instead in a true and proper proto-racism. And in fact, in all this, if you understand also the psychological sequence is pretty simple, right? Because the recrimination against the Jews, enemies of Christianity, as usurers and supporters, even if hidden supporters in the sense of the Ottomans, were being used at this point to develop, even unconsciously in a certain sense, but still eventually for which, more open, explicit things flourished, the spread or, elitary conviction that the Jews were incapable of recognizing the truth that they had actually stemmed out of their own fate and their own history, for which whoever would have accepted the true fate in this sense would have redeemed himself of any past error, right? And the reason why this bias started to affirm itself is that probably, I would say that certain things are simply not documented. Maybe this attitude was much older than that. It wouldn't be that difficult, Frank. But properly here, there is the consolidation of an idea that in the Jews, in the intimacy of the Jews, that would be harbored something hereditary, like a radically biological diversity that would predispose them to evil, right? And it is notorious that the theorization of this difference in markedly racist terms that is with the support of scientific, let's say, pseudo-scientific claims, wouldn't present itself before the 18th century with categorization, with properly this idea of, this obsession for classification that we still have today, fundamentally as modern people, and that we haven't abandoned. It didn't exist up to a couple of centuries ago, right? Think about it culturally. And that definitely fueled racism like hell. But, however, from the other hand, it's been pointed out that, albeit maintaining the neat distinction between the theological and proselytistic anti-Judaism from one side and the political and racist/determinist racism, anti-Semitism from the other, already some elements that were, as we were saying just right now, being present in the first could prelude to the latter, right? And as we were saying before, in the Spain of the 16th and the 17th century, the nobility insisted on their own limpieza de sangre, which, especially in Spain, was ridiculous because the amount of Jewish population historically had always been astonishingly high, right? Especially in certain, in Aragon. If you look at, we made a video about the Mudéjars recently. We're not talking about all the, the North Africans that, that had been injected throughout, for the first Arab invasions, the Almohads, the Almoravids, the fact that the Reconquista had lasted for, the Muslim state, essentially for 700 years in Spain, right? And so, what is the limpieza de sangre? It's bullshit, right? To say the least. And of course, this had been boosted almost Freudian-like, because exactly they knew pretty damn well that they were mixed like hell, but they had based their own statal construction on the Reconquista, and so the fight of Christendom to get rid properly from a certain land and of community of Muslims and of Jews, because that also was part of, even though there were important moments of syncresis that were even institutionally recognized. Remember that the Spanish Empire, the Castilians founded in the 11th century, claimed among the titles properly protector the Christians, the Jews, and the Muslims for the king, right? Because that was a time in which still the odds were even, and they needed the support of Jews and Muslims to kick out other Muslims, right? And that's what so these people also did, because again, there is hardly any specific religious logic to the so-called wars of religion, right? There is so much more. It's always political, it's always social, right? Religion is there, it's important, but it's not all. And as also history tells, the thing didn't end in 1492, right? There was always this genealogical ambiguity of the Cristianos Nuevos, right? In terms of some would like to see a sort of proto-racist tone in a way, right? Who are you, right? It's the same thing like the Nazis did. What were your grandparents? What was the thing? If you had one grandparent who was a Jew, you could leave, or if you had two, you were. So if one of your parents was, you had to die, or something less. Well, maybe it was less, if I'm not wrong. Too polluted for Nazi standards, right? But if you look at modern history, and you find stuff like that, and you never have to think again that before there weren't a similar form of discriminations. So this thing was much more imbued and properly felt and seen. But this passes through also lots of other things. The same Reformation, Counter-Reformation had, in a sense, exasperated some of these aspects at the same time. Because if you start hating each other as Christians, you can imagine how much you can hate even different religions more, from not maybe not factually, because as we have seen, the Protestants or even the French preferred maybe to back the Ottomans at times against the Habsburgs and Catholics broadly meant. The French were Catholics themselves, but so for reasons, as you understand, that are not religious. But ideologically, right, you set the basis for saying you're properly a different thing, right? And there is all very interesting cultural development about this. It's also the hypocrisy of this all, right? For example, the nobilization of the enemy. After the Reconquista finished, hatred, in a sense, aside from this inner aspects, was towards the Moor, the guy from the other side of the straits, was like, the Moors now started being represented as noblemen, right? People were proud and good because, if you had such enemies, the more merit there was for your victory. There were all these things. They existed also with the Ottomans, the Christians. They did the same thing with each other all the time. So it's very hard not to see proto-racism in expressions such as the one of the fetor Judaicus, right? What it means. So the smell, essentially emanated by Jews, on which Martin Luther himself had insisted in his very astonishingly violent anti-Judaic works, right? That were properly affirmed at that point as a stereotype, right? Even if maybe this phenomenon could depend on hygienic or food, alimentary reasons, or maybe the daily use of specific cosmetic and medical substances. The Jews also had properly, as we were saying before, different jobs they were forced into, so that's not really like the smell with which they were discriminated were also the handgunners, right? Because they had to deal with sulfur that reminded the devil and stuff. There were these kind of atrociously painful discriminations all over society at the time. As we were saying before, the nobility thought literally to be a proto-racially superior community compared to peasants that were considered barely as human beings. Like, look at, some of the most radically ferocious discriminations in this sense were in the East. Look at what the Polish Szlachta believed of the peasantry, right, and how they treated them. There is hardly anything more violent in those contexts in historical perspective, right? The myth there of the nation is bullshit. The Szlachta even preferred to say that they were Sarmatians, to distinguish themselves from this outfit properly from an ethnic point of view. Understand that from these other people. And this thing existed since back in the day. I mean, let's be honest, the Indo-European conquerors, but also other peoples like the Turks, etc., wherever they arrived, they believed in the principle of the superiority of the strongest and the rightfulness that once you had defeated the weaker, you had the right to dispose of them whatever you liked. It took Christianity to teach people to understand the slaves were human beings. I mean, this is hardly, this is such a wide dynamic that we don't have, I think the honest, but these things are not taught. Like, if you taught these things at school to kids, instead, though, having barely educated teachers who have just to, take the school program to the end of the line before the end of the terms of the year, so that they can get their modest income, so that they can hope to pay the rent, and they don't, of course, give a shit about providing a real culture to the next generations, we would maybe really live in a better world, right? And it does pass through admitting what do we have to admit? Like, if you're not a racist or an anti-Semitic today, you have nothing to excuse yourself for. Never think that bullshit that is emerging now in the States, where you see that, whites are accused of being intrinsically evil or colonialists, that's just a product of under-education, right? Of people that don't even know that they're criticizing other people, first of all, being racist themselves, and failing badly at showing to understand what racism actually is. So that if they complain because they're ones that suffered it historically, even if they were born and raised in a non-slavery society, they fail badly, and that's a product actually of their country's education or whatever that they get educated through, and actually also the proof that certain things are always to be retaught to people, that it doesn't take to live in a developed world not to be an intelligent person. Again, never think that because you went to school or you have a degree, you're anything, competent about even the same topic you're allegedly specialized in. That has absolutely nothing to do with scientific standards today. Well, it's never been, but at least before the elite was slightly, more prepared individually. Today, the standards are utterly disgusting, right? But these things must be taught. People must speak about them. Right, because otherwise we will always be doing the same thing. I don't like the idea, wow, we have to study history so that we can't, we won't repeat the same mistakes. It's stupid to believe that they are the same mistakes, because that lowers your guard, decreases your responsibility, it seduces you to believe that the mistakes are always the same. Instead, they are always different, because reality is always different. But indeed, if people just studied history, they would realize that at least much of the bullshit they completely invent for reasons of personal insecurity and mediocrity, and properly as a declaration of inferiority as an idiot, because that's the stupidity is consistently the only valid reason to discriminate a people against. Well, we would live in a decent world where these problems would also represent themselves less, right? So in any case, it is through these steps, right? Think about Protestantism and Luther. Aside from the various branches of Protestantism that also kind of went pretty much, astray and kind of even more radical compared to Luther himself. But if the base, the standard, the normal, is having such prejudices against the Jews, well, you can't really expect much positive things to come from it, to say the least, right? So this idea that was within the Jews something biologically intrinsic, a sort of signum infamiae, as it was told, a sign of infamy, impressed, by the way, them by God, right? Before that, in analogy with the same, the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 would properly impose the rota, the distinctive mark on their clothes, right? So, again, right? These things existed back in the day, since a very long time. Anti-Semitism in something so, so you have to stay alert with these things, because you can't study history pretending that things change from, like, if they went on for millennia, that, you can say, well, okay, just speak with somebody and you will change his mind. No. These things live on in cultures, unfortunately. There are an astonishing amount of anti-Semitic people, which I repeat, I had never met before at some point in my life. Like, I thought they were, like, are you kidding me? Like, what do you have, really? What's wrong with, how can you, first of all, discriminate somebody for their own religion until this person really do not do anything because of that? And even, at that point, that they're misusing their religion, right? You can easily see it. You think that terrorists or, ISIS or Taliban actually have anything to do with understanding the Quran? That surely says something quite disturbing, but also the Bible says at some point, right? There are different philosophies that give you that. They are, there are cultural differences, but, that in Central Africa, certain Christians still burn women as witches. But why? Because they're Christian? No, because, some third world realities still have severe problems with, what is even the value of human life. The same goes for, the broader Muslim world in some ways or another, right? There are changes in the most developed places. According to you, why? Well, because, again, human intelligence is pretty universal, and when it's exposed to the right conditions, it does things makes things better. In any case, you can't quite make a quick step saying, no, I forgot everything's fine. No, this bias is going to stay there for a while, right? And especially if you hide that and you don't have a serious discussion about it, which has nothing to do with, like, if you really, you see, this sounds like a leftist argument. It's really not, because all these leftists themselves, they say, as a white person, I'm intrinsically racist myself. Well, it's maybe because you really are racist as a person, because you really were grown up by undereducated parents who were dumb as fuck, and that you were raised as a racist. I had biases of different type in my background, but incidentally, there was no such thing like racism or anti-Semitism, right? Give you maybe some forms of cultural racism, but in this sense, not really based on race from a pseudo-scientific background. And I kind of, educated myself to rationally understand that you have to understand certain backgrounds in order to fix the problem, that there is no precondition that should make you feel guilty about anything that you haven't really done, right? But again, we are dealing with people that come from emarginated, poor, undereducated realities, and that's bad, right? And so the problem is like the rates of people getting killed in general. Why does this happen? Like, or even, the problem of feminicide. Like, one good reason is surely, fixing the problem from a cultural point of view. You should teach, really, a lot of men what it means to respect a woman. But also, you should look at the background of those people and seeing that maybe if most of these things happen in socioeconomically degraded realities, maybe fixing those realities would be also an indirect way to, dramatically improve the problem, aside from fixating on a narrow ideology and hoping that changes things magically when you don't even take into consideration the actual problem behind that. But in any case, the news of the liberation of Vienna, or the salvation of Vienna, and the immediately subsequent ones that provided a bit too optimistic picture of the success of the imperial army at the pursuit of what remained of the Ottoman one provoked, among other things, also another wave of enthusiasm for the perspectives of a last and definitive crusade. Because again, you can't study a 1683 concept thinking that crusades were just a medieval stuff. Most people still lived within that ideology. The Pope surely was firmly believing and working with decision with the constitution, as it's famous enough, of a Holy League, to which participated immediately the Empire, Poland, shortly after also Venice joined, especially in the so-called Spanish Italy. That is to say, the area was governed by the Spanish, Milan, the south, etc. Was introduced the fiscal contribution, known as the Cruzada, in fact. Many were talking literally and seriously about the quick, soon recovery of the holy places. This is a bit the same wave of enthusiasm that had followed shortly after the Battle of Lepanto, etc. Because, speaking from a political and strategical point of view, well, yeah, I mean, as you know, it's not really, it doesn't take much to destroy a country. The problem is how you can keep it standing, right? The reason why an Ottoman Empire lasted until 1918 is obviously because, Europeans didn't want to tear it apart, because they feared that one of them would be too powerful in the consequence, right? And the question was, yes, okay, we invest money in taking out Constantinople, and then what? Like, what will happen afterwards in these places? Would it be actually better? But aside from the fact that at this point the Ottoman Empire was still a power, we have seen how harsh eventually was all the campaigning along the Danubian area in the Balkans, etc. After the victory of Vienna, the difficulties, the lack of funding, the lack of interest. Properly, the Habsburgs had other interests at that point, knock the Ottomans out. Now the problem is the French that have a foot in Germany at that point, and so that's actually a much more concrete problem you have to deal with. Again, they gave a few actually about having a Muslim or a Christian neighbor, as long as these threatened them consistently. So the glorious day of the 12th of September 1683 provided also the decisive impulse for a new canonization. That was the one of Giovanni da Capistrano, the observing Franciscan that had been in the mid-15th century the indefatigable preacher of the crusade, that had, this is the time of Hunyadi, of the siege of Belgrade, the great moments of glory of the anti-Ottoman resistance in the Balkans, at least from these foreign powers, from the Hungarians, from the Italians, from all the European crusaders that papal money, etc., that went there in order to invest in there, in order to stem the Ottoman advance. That could have been reversed in a sense. Again, never think too much deterministically in history. War, remember this, war is the most unpredictable of all human activities by scale, right, proportionate. So that there is always a chance to really make things as they do. That's why it's also beautiful to study military history, because it makes you realize how easily things could go in a different way, right? Well, Giovanni da Capistrano, or John of Capistrano, as it's also sometimes said in English, was during the siege, properly the months of the siege of Vienna, by will of Pope Innocent, object of a continuous cult, right? A lamp burned day and night in front of his picture, his image, that was posed on the major altar of the Roman Church of the Araceli. And once that Vienna was liberated, the gratitude of the Pope would be properly substantiated, as in 1690 John was proclaimed saint, that he still is for at least the Catholic Church. So we've talked about heavy things, heavy stuff. I know that there is always, as we were saying before, if the bias is there, it's confirming my own ideas, I will probably get some, rejection, but I don't care, because I, of course, speak, after having had some opinion of mine that, I can tell you, I thought some time about it. It's a very rare eventuality to make me change it for that matter. But I hope it's important. I hope it's important properly to be punching, to say things as they are, not to give half measures, because most of these problems derive from the undecisiveness of people on them, right? After all, the reason why you come here is that you want to know how things are, right? Even if you can't believe, not believe, you have your own bias, your own preconceptions. We all have, right? But I'm trying to put out a method, right? Properly, to a dialectical one, to say, okay, when you have to approach a problem, you have to be real, you have to be objective as much as you can, right? It's not, but the more, until you don't do it, you do it, you can't really get how beneficial it can be, right? And this is crucial, right? Never make gross over generalizations, approximations, simplifications, but be real, be consistent, be concrete, because history is concrete, it's as concrete as it can get, right? As it gets, and it doesn't leave you for such ambiguities, right? When you're being persecuted, running for your life, being expelled by your country, there's not really an historiographical perspective that can tell you that is not real, right? Independently from the reasons or the context or whatever. So that's, again, as real as it gets, and one must make the effort to reconstruct it accurately, right? All right, so we will keep, I will say this, I think I made only a video about Jewish history during the Middle Ages a couple of years ago. It was bad stuff at the time. I would speak even worse than now. It wasn't anything. It was about medieval Jewry, I think. But we'll keep talking about Jewish history because it's first of all, it's really interesting. Secondly, it has all these broader implications that are useful for understanding the world, our reality, our conscience, and all these things. So, and I hope really to have lots of Jewish followers that never, I don't need to know, right? I just hope if they want to stop by and say, okay, well, I appreciate, because I know, at least what my proximity of my family people went through. Okay, I hope to have said things correctly in a historical sense, right? Because I don't do this for any other reason, right? But what I objectivity, and hope that this can help others. And for now, I stop it here though. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.